Okay, warm welcome everybody to the information session of the Racial Equity Index. And today we have invited the Racial Equity Index to join us in a conversation to explore their work and their efforts on building more equity or accountability for racial equity in the international development sector and space. And today we are actually going to dive further into this. And just before heading into the basics of the session and handing it over to Uma from the Racial Equity Index, I would love to have a quick introduction of basically what Partos is, because I'm not sure if everybody here is familiar with the work of Partos, and also why we are engaging with this topic. So as a branch organization for Dutch NGOs working in international development, we also want to engage and center diversity, equity, and inclusion and racial justice more in our own work and strategies, and herewith also incentivize our member network of over 100 organizations working in this field. And we have seen over the past years that there has been an influx of more initiatives around inclusion, diversity, equity, also racial justice, but the space for sharing best practices has been somewhat absent. And therefore, as a platform organization, we wanted to kick this off by basically offering a trajectory where organizations can come together to actually champion their own practices in their organizations towards committing on racial justice, on diversity, equity practices, et cetera, et cetera. So we developed a module, and in this module, we'll have like 6 different themes where we explore the different elements of what it means to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion in your work. And we're deep down in module 3 at the moment, which is on measuring and monitoring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of our main partners in this trajectory, or who's also doing a lot of good work, is the Racial Equity Index, who has developed a index and tools to actually understand how your organization can commit more and where they're sitting with regards to building racial equity. And I can say that this is a crucial element. There is no way that you can ignore the element of racial equity when you're talking about the space of DEI work. And looking at the international development sector and the way that we have our history and legacy with colonialism, but at the same time also ongoing practices and experiences of people of color, Black people, Indigenous people that have expressed that there are still forms of discrimination that are surfacing within our organizations and systems. It is now time to actually start understanding what it means in practice. And there are a lot of examples and I think practical approaches to deal with this, which we will see today. I will not have a lot of speaking time today because I can hand it over to the Racial Equity Index that has 2 people today present. Uma and Lena, say hi, hello. I just wanted to say if there are any questions throughout the session, you can share it in the chat. We will be there, and also from the Racial Equity Index, there will be people to answer. And if there are any questions regarding the work of Partos regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can always reach me. So I will hand it over to Uma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gigi, and thank you so much, everyone. It's so great to be here with you all and sharing this time. I want to introduce myself a little bit and then also ask Lena to introduce herself. So my name is Uma, as Gigi noted, and I am the initiator and the facilitator for the Racial Equity Index. I'm going to be sharing the background of the Racial Equity Index, who we are, how we came together, the work we're doing, noting as well that I'm a senior consultant with the Better Org, which is based in the United Kingdom. And I will also be talking about the Better Org because the Better Org is an integral part of, how organizations interact with the Racial Equity Index. So you'll learn kind of both sides of that piece. My background within global development is very diverse. diverse in that I have worked in the women's rights space, human rights defender space. I was the former executive director of Women's March Global, and have really been very outspoken about the issues of white supremacy and really bad practices within organizations in the global development sector. So with that, I'm going to ask Lena. Lena, can you please introduce yourself and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Uma, and lovely to be here with you all. So I'm Lena Biru. I lead the anti-racism and equity work at BOND, which is the UK network for international development organisations. So similar to Partos in the Netherlands. I'm also an organiser and campaigner with grassroots movements in the UK, Charity So White, which is working to root out racism in the UK charity sector, and obviously part of the Racial Equity Index, which is an amazing collective that you'll hear more about as well. So good to be here.
Thanks so much, Lena. So I do want to share with you all just a little bit about the Racial Equity Index. You may or may not have heard of us. You may or may not be familiar with our work. So just so everyone is aware and also just has the same information, we are going to go through a little bit about our work and who we are, why we exist as a collective, and also what we're trying to do and what we have been able to do with, with organizations. So the Racial Equity Index is a BIPOC formed and led volunteer collective. I will say volunteer many, many times over because we although we have been around for over 2 years, the funding has been very limited for our work. So we have continued as volunteers this entire time. With the Racial Equity Index, we started as a collective in 2020 when, we saw this with the murder of George Floyd, how that cracked open the entire world, but also the global development sector, to really expose the systemic racism and systemic inequities within the global development sector. In the months that followed, a group of folks, including myself and Lena and other folks that work within the global development sector, are global development practitioners, really started asking questions around why data for racial equity wasn't being collected within global development. The global development sector loves data, right? We know this, they measure everything. And yet we don't have any actual transparent or trackable data on racial equity in organizations or organizations' commitment to racial equity and the progress or lack thereof that may be happening with organizations across the global development sector. So the Racial Equity Index was very much born from in response to this need for accounting for the immense lack of racial equity in the global development space. With our collective, we recognize that the sector at large, it doesn't matter which, where the organizations may be based, but the sector at large has a very poor track record as it relates to engaging with issues of racial equity and racial justice in a meaningful manner. It's particularly stark when we acknowledge the colonial roots of modern global development practice, and also the hesitation, the resistance, the fragility on engaging truly in these conversations in a way where there is shared accountability, shared transference of knowledge. Gigi brought this up in the introduction, that there are very limited spaces to actually engage in this work in a way where knowledge is not only shared, but transferred, and in a way where we are acknowledging that this is a journey for everybody involved, right? And there is no perfection, but we have to have open conversations around best practices. What do we mean by best practices? But we have to have open conversations around all of this in order to see any kind of progress around these issues. So we are a group of BIPOC people based globally and have over 50 years of direct experience within the global development sector. All of us within the Racial Equity Index have experienced racism and racial violence in global development organizations throughout our time in global development. So we are a group of people with lived experience of how racial inequity shows up in organizations and shows up in the global development sector. And it is from that place where we have started our work and these conversations around racial equity and global development and what that even means. So our mission for the Racial Equity Index is really to build the first ever accountability system, the first ever index to hold the global development sector accountable in dismantling all forms of systemic racism throughout the sector. We are doing this in different ways, but the primary way that we are engaging with this is to build an index where we can track and measure how racial equity changes over time in the global development sector. We'll get into some of the details, but that is kind of the overarching mission that we have committed to. One thing, and I said in the, just a couple of minutes ago, we are a group of people who have lived experience of what racial inequity does to people. And the reason I say this and the reason I bring this up is because there are many conversations around DEI. There are many conversations, perhaps less so, around racial equity. And we talk about these efforts, DEI and inclusion efforts, as efforts. We forget many, many times that there are people at the end of what the lack of those efforts, what the lack of the rootedness of those efforts, what the lack of commitment to racial equity is right, for people of color and Black people. There's a incredible quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates that says, and he says, racism is a visceral experience. It cracks bones, it breaks teeth. These are not issues that are just organizational issues. This is not a system issue. This is an individual experience that is part of a system that has not done the work to really address what racial equity is, how it shows up, how racial inequity thrives and breeds within organizations. So we really need to always root in the understanding that this is an issue that impacts individuals. Yes, it lives within organizations, but for us at the Racial Equity Index, our focus is always on the people, right? Because we know the impacts of racial inequity, we know the impacts of racism, we know the impacts of racial violence. So I want to name that, and it may be uncomfortable to hear, and that's okay too, but it is vital and it is important. So we are values rooted. I don't want to say values driven. We are a values rooted collective. We are a consensus-based decision-making collective. We practice and live and move in many different ways throughout all of our values that we have committed to in terms of creating welcoming spaces, being intentional in our intersectionality, being transparent, meaning that we talk about the issues, we talk about the lack of funding, we talk about the competition and the scrutiny that we face. We are also humble in the fact that we know what we know and we don't know what we don't know, and so we're always on a constant learning journey. We are deeply anti-racist and practice radical empathy, and so that is who we are as a collective. Our people, this is our core working group, and again we are across the world. I will add the people that are not on this list are our peer reviewers, who are majority from the global majority. And these are a group of people who independently review all of our research, all of our questions. They are there as a sounding board, and an incredible group of people. And then additionally, our advisory council as well. Again, a really incredible group of people that is helping support the development of our collective. So I'm going to now get into kind of the work of the Racial Equity Index, because I want you all to have the information in terms of what we are trying to do and how organizations can engage with our work. If at any time you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them. Hopefully, I think we'll have enough time. But for our collective, we work in two kind of different ways: community work and then organizational partnerships / consulting work. So our community work is really where we are building those spaces for knowledge sharing and conversations. This is very much, this exchange with Partos is very much part of this process. We hold an anniversary event whenever we have the capacity to really commit to it. We do hold an anniversary event in July, and then we also participate in sector-wide knowledge sharing via our numerous kind of blog posts. And last year we did a podcast, but our recent blog post is talking about co-directorship and how it's a new glass cliff for Black women and women of color. It's a really, really interesting and vital exploration, I think, in terms of what is happening within the global development sector. Then additionally, we do partner with organizations in different ways to not only support organizations in their racial equity journey and exploration, but also participate in a learning partnership to learn from the organizations that participate in the Racial Equity Index. So one thing that I do want to note is that our ability to commune with organizations and to work with organizations is supported by our learning partnership with the Better Org. And the Better Org is a consultancy that is very much committed to organizational change and development within the global development sector, but very much exclusively focused on care-centered approaches and practices, and also with a dedication to improving culture, of which DEI is culture. That is part and parcel of an organization. So the Better Org and the Racial Equity Index have a learning partnership, and any organization that engages with the Racial Equity Index does so through the Better Org, because again, the Racial Equity Index is a group of volunteers. So we don't have the capacity to support fully with organizations. That is what the Better Org helps us with. So with the Better Org, what you'll find out is that we've already supported a couple of organizations in racial equity audits, and we've utilized the Racial Equity Index as part of that audit process. It's been a really interesting experience for us because the learnings come back to the Racial Equity Index and allow us to ask further questions and build out the tool that we're building out in different ways. So it's a really unique partnership, and we're really grateful to the Better Org to be able to support and host this. So if you have any questions, do let me know in terms of Better Org, Racial Equity Index, and how we fit together. In terms of the building of the Racial Equity Index, the next couple of slides, I'm going to take you through what we're actually doing in terms of launching and building the index and the steps that we've taken in order to get to where we are. We've been on this journey since 2020. It's been a lot of work and a lot of research. We launched our global mapping survey in 2020, at the end of 2020. And that global mapping survey, again, went out to individuals across the global development sector. We're not interested in just working with an HR department at an organization. We want to know what racial equity means for every single individual within an organization. And therein lies the key difference with a lot of, versus a lot of different audit processes or, other DEI surveys. For us, it's really important that every single individual is able, if they choose to participate, to voice how racial equity or racial inequity shows up in the organization. So with the global mapping survey, this was a survey that went out to individuals across the sector. We asked individuals to rate what they think of when they think of racial equity and how it shows up in organizations. What are the words that come to mind? And we provided a list of indicators so that people could also rate what matters to them in terms of racial inequity and where it lives in organizations. We also asked, two questions, qualitative questions on if the individuals had experienced or either witnessed racism in global development. From all of that data, we spent, Lena, you have to correct me if I'm wrong. I think it took us about almost a year to do a data analysis on quantitative and qualitative data, and use that data to not only build out all of the indicators that I'll show you in a minute, but also then add subcodes to our indicators for racial equity. Right now, where we are is building out the index and the testing of the survey that informs the index. We are just finishing our final peer review feedback process, and we're hoping that we're able to launch the index Q1 or Q2 of 2024. sorry, I had to remember what year we are in, Q1 or Q2 of 2024. So we have been on a very long journey, but we're nearing the end, hopefully, to at least this initial launch. So, this is a really great opportunity for organizations to engage with us, because it helps us, again, feed in this learning to this first version of the index. So what is a racial equity index? We have built, based on the research that we just reviewed, 11 indicators to measure how racial inequity shows up within organizations. The indicators themselves allow us to explore where racial equity lives or does not live within organizations across an entire organization. So these indicators span from mission, leadership, compensation, all the way to communications and programming, salary, fund allocations, human resource management. So we're really looking at every single layer of an organization to understand how racial equity is either embedded or not embedded within each of those layers. Additionally, based on, again, the data that we got from the Global Mapping Survey, what we have now done is added under each indicator subcodes to help us explore, again, how each indicator is rooted within an organization. So for example, for the indicator workplace culture, what consists of creating a workplace culture where racial equity is thriving, right? And and is present. So one of the subcodes that we have added to workplace culture is there racial abuse present within the organization or not? And what does that look like? Is there a prioritization of white voices? Is there gaslighting and tokenism present within the organization? All of those subcodes, again, feeding into the indicator workplace culture. So on each level, you would receive, if an organization were to take this, a score for the subcodes and then also a score for the indicator itself. So the subcodes really allow us to explore the depth of the environment of racial inequity that lives within an organization. And each indicator has its own subcodes. The subcodes, we are moving through, again, our final round of peer review feedback, and we're in the final stages of updating them. But we believe they are really important layers for us to understand, again, how racial inequity is either present or not within an organization. So I want to pause there because I do want Lena to come in and talk a little bit before we turn this over to you all for any questions about, Lena, if you can speak to why organizations should really consider participating in the Racial Equity Index, and especially given your work at Bond, how this is beneficial for organizations in the work to decolonize.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Uma. So being at Bond and having a sector-wide kind of view is a really interesting place to sit. And we know since 2020 that organizations have said that they want to be anti-racist, want to be inclusive, want to work on their EDI policies and create change in the way that they do their work and their organizational culture. But we also know that organizations are grappling with what it is they can actually do. So organizations put out statements in 2020, and then some have dabbled in different areas, whether it's their communications or reviewing HR practices. But the audit and the index is really an opportunity to have a holistic view of what it means to create change. And we're seeing more and more organizations now take audits, which is incredible. They're also following through and sharing the responses and the findings of those audits. That does mean that organizations are putting their money where their mouth is. I don't know if that translates, but it basically is about them going further than just putting out a statement saying we want to be inclusive. We know this is the right thing to do. We work in international development and we know there is a problem. And so moving past those statements, they're actually looking at what can they do and how can they start to address both their culture as organizations internally, and of course that feeds into how they work with partners around the world, how they work with suppliers, who is in meetings, who they work with and who's in their networks as well. So it has a trickle-on effect. It's really been amazing to see. I mean, it's been a handful so far of organizations who have who have engaged in audits and shared very vulnerably and openly their responses. But it's also shown real leadership, and that is something that we definitely need in this sector more and more. So I think with the Racial Equity Index, it has that holistic approach. It does really say, we have a problem in the sector, but let's look at it at every single level. Doing things in silos, as we have been doing in the past, doesn't get us to where we want to be. It isn't just one person's or the CEO's problem. Actually, there's something that we can do across the whole of an organization. And this is a tool, a very real tool that organizations can engage with to surface the issues that we know are going on in organizations that bubble under the surface. And by surfacing them, we can start to create the tools and pick up the tools that can create change at all those different levels. And not only that, I would say that this is an amazing tool to use because it's so transparent in an organization, and taking your staff along with you, creating the culture where there is transparency, accountability, and honesty is really important. And this is what we're seeing more and more with organizations who are engaging with REI, with the Racial Equity Index. So in my mind, it's a no-brainer, because if we say as INGOs, we want to make this world a better place and more equitable, it needs to start with us, and we need to start doing this work. And this is an amazing opportunity that organizations should be committing to. And it's something that also you get support with as well. Just as Uma has said, it's not just a one-off thing. It's really about helping your organization go on a journey to be better, and you're not doing it on your own as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lena. One last thing that I'll add before we open to questions, and I see a question already in the chat, so thank you so much for asking this, Rohit. So in terms of the experience or the availability for organizations, we will, after this session, Gigi and parts of the Partos team will be sending out the video recording along with a Typeform link, so that if you are interested in just having a conversation with a better org in the Racial Equity Index to participate, or if you're interested in what participation in the Racial Equity Index looks like, you can submit your interest and we will get back to you. But usually what we have done with previous organizations that have taken the Racial Equity Index is to engage with the organizations, do a little bit of a discovery process so that we can understand what are the context specific questions that we may need to add to the survey to make it more applicable for the organization. So that discovery process may take some time, but then developing and finalizing the survey, making sure that it's accessible in terms of language needs or any other accessibility needs, and then sending that out to your organization staff and contractors and whoever is within the scope of participation, and then delivering a complete report. The engagement as well can be longer. So we've done engagements with organizations where the Racial Equity Index is used as part of a larger racial equity audit for the organization entirely. And so this is just one piece of data then that is collected as part of a more complete racial equity audit. So there's multiple ways to engage with this process. And, I think it just requires conversation in terms of what is the capacity, what is the possibility, what are your, thoughts and needs around it. So I want to just respond to Rohit's question, and then to open it up to everybody if you have any questions. So Rohit is noting, please share your link with intersectionality. One thing that I will say is that the survey that we use in terms of the Racial Equity Index is extensive in its approach to not only capture the many layers that are included with racial equity, but also provide an opportunity to explore other forms of discrimination and oppression. And so we do collect demographic data to include disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other forms, other demographic identities, so that we can explore when we look at responses. What are the different intersections and experiences of individuals within their responses? We do ask participants to consider an intersectional lens when responding to the questions, which notes and acknowledges that individuals have interconnected social identities that can compound experiences of marginalization and oppression. We also recognize that individuals with marginalized social identities experience different degrees of disadvantage and types of disadvantage and power and privilege based on the identities that they hold. And so we do add this within the survey, but we do also analyze the survey utilizing that framework and that lens as well.
Thank you, Uma.
Yeah,
absolutely. Very well explained. We'll keep contact about this maybe on a later moment.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
And then there's a question, which international NGOs have you already been working with? Unfortunately, we cannot disclose them due to, just privacy. But we have worked with a number now and are actively working with one current NGO / funder. Yeah, that is what I can say. Lena, can you highlight more?
No, so we have had interest, of course, and I think that's an interesting question actually, because we talk about transparency and openness as well, and so it'll be interesting to see once some of the work is done. It's really up to the organizations how and if they want to share more publicly, and that would be great. I think that, and my hope would be that we get to a critical mass where we have engaged with so many that then kind of just becomes the next natural step. But as probably you all are aware, this work is hard, and so some of this work gets done behind closed doors, and this is part and parcel of what we're trying to do with the index to make it more transparent and to kind of encourage people that transparency is a good thing. It's important, but you know how change happens, right? It's one at a time, and then it's a critical mass of people, and so we hope we get there.
Yeah, no, that's such an important point, Lena. And when we started when the collective started the work on the index, our aim was to publicly be able to list organizations that were willing to participate. What we have recognized now is that the sector is really not ready for that level of accountability or transparency. And so this is why we have really open to working with organizations privately, because we also understand what the implications may be from the funders within this landscape as well, and the power dynamics inherent within that. So yeah. Carol, your question, if you have time, can you expand on your comment about shared leadership being the new glass cliff? Yes, I mean, this is a much larger conversation. What I will say, and I'm happy to share the link, is what we have said, I'm sure many folks know the glass cliff phenomenon, in which a woman or a person of color is recruited, into a position of power during a time of crisis, which creates then a situation in which failure is likely, and the leadership position is precarious. And that phenomenon has been around for a while. What we have observed, just even in this, in the past couple of years, is what we've deemed the new glass cliff, which specifically involves Black women and women of color who are placed into leadership positions alongside white women and white people, often to much celebration and backpatting by organizations on diversifying leadership. But what inherently happens is that these BIPOC women leaders are positioned then as buffers for white leadership partners, and left to absorb and manage toxic work environments, insane leadership demands, with very little recognition and an utter lack of support. And so that is what we have deemed the new glass cliff, and we are seeing it far too often, and it crumbles Black women and women of color. And and unfortunately, what we are also seeing as a result of it is Black women and women of color who are incredible leaders leaving the sector as a result. So the blog is here. I invite everybody to read it and share it and continue the discussions around it. In terms of the question around where equity lies in an organization, does it also stimulate to think about follow-up actions so that it's not a one-off thing? Really interesting question. Can I ask them, and I'm sorry, I want to make sure that I pronounce your name correctly. Can you speak a little bit more to what you mean in terms of knowing or how we sustain these efforts?
Yeah, sure. You pronounce my name as Ijoma.
Ijoma, thank you so much, Ijoma.
Yeah, I think it's also a thing that a lot of organizations are struggling with. We as Rutgers as well. Like we really want to map out where like the inequalities lie, where we can improve, but we're still finding ways how we can ensure that all the efforts we put in are sustainable, and not that when the index is done, that we then just fall back into like old habits, or, you know, it also has to do with cultural values, organizational culture and habits and behavior. It's very difficult to change. So I'm sure the index also addresses it, but I want to hear from you, like, did organizations share like similar experiences that they wonder like, okay, what now, like after it's done? Yeah,
I'll just start and you can come in. Thanks for that question. It's a really good one, and also great to hear that organizations are also thinking about this as well, because, you know, back in 2020 we saw the observation was there was a statement and that was it. There was the lack of the disconnect between long-term and actual sustainable. When are you actually done with this work? It's not a tick box exercise. And the index, because it's so, I would say, so permeating, and it, as you said, it maps out the different areas of where we need to think about these. And these are not, you know, not refined, because within organizations you may unearth more and more different areas that aren't the same with all organizations. So it can be really bespoke, but it is about how do you embed it, right? And it's not about we've done the index and it's done. It's we've done the index and we're now going to start. And that's how it has to be. And certainly when it comes to making it sustainable and making it, because when we talk about these issues, these are deep-seated, rooted issues that will not be solved overnight. And we need to think about how you're embedding change in your organization across multiple different levels. And that can mean anything from your annual reviews, from your one-to-ones, like your actual work. How are you tracking it, taking accountability for it, measuring it, and then remeasuring it? And how are you tracking your progress over a longer period of time? So there are different ways that we can do this, working in different areas, whether it's communications, policy, HR, whatever it might be. There are different ways that lend itself to the different functions, but it is about how do you track it and how do you make it also. I think one of the things that we think about a lot is how do we make this as easy as possible? Because we see time and time again, we know that all of this work can be uncomfortable for some people to really engage in this work. And how do we make it as easy as possible, take away as many barriers as we can, make it embedded and just another thing that you don't need to think about, it automatically comes to you. But that's really about looking at the work of the organization and how you do your day-to-day work and making it connected to your work plans, to your team plans, to the strategy at every single level, not just one level which gets visited once a year. We want to make this an everyday kind of knowledge building within the organization. So it is about getting into the fabric and the skin of the organization and the work of it. So that's a really important part of it. And I think it's also the follow-up. It's not do the index and full stop. It's do the index and now start, if that makes sense.
No, and Ijoma, this is such an important question. And one of the things to add to what Lina has said is, you know, too often we see that, you know, an organization will receive the results of, you know, the racial equity index or any DEI survey for that matter, and say, oh my God, this is really just terrible to read. You know, this makes me really sad. I've heard all of those things, and we need to fix this. We need to fix this today. And what they fail to recognize time and time again is, you know, for example, when we look at workplace culture, and if for you know, just to give an example, if there has been a high prioritization of white voices, that has left an impact on people, that has silenced people, that has, you know, the fractures that have appeared from that you know, from that embedded practice over and over and over again has impacted people. It has, you know, it has presented deep trust issues. And so that cannot just be glossed over and plastered over by some sort of DEI strategy based off of the results of a DEI survey or even the racial equity index, you know, findings. So this is constant and emergent work, and you know, the sustaining of the work, and this is, you know, I think for us at the Racial Equity Index, why we are so focused on the individuals is because it has to be an individual effort. It cannot just be, you know, from the leaders of an organization, because even the leadership has to be held accountable for how they show up in these conversations. And so, you know, as Lena said, our hope always is to be able to do this annually with organizations so that we're having continued conversations, you know, for this journey. Yeah. But thank you so much for asking the question.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Carol, I see your hand up, and then we'll take Liz's question in the chat as well.
Thank you. Well, first of all, this is so useful because we really need to focus on operationalization, and what's missing is tools. And this is, you know, as we support organization go through this process, it ends up being so much time to just have internal conversations, focus groups and interviews. And then that's also time and resources taken away from actually cleaning up, for instance, you know, 30 years of HR policies that are, yeah, it takes a huge amount of work to clean that up. So having a benchmarking like this really can sort of, while really surfacing what needs to surface, can actually accelerate the first part of this process. And so I just want to say I really appreciate that. And now I've forgotten my other point. Yes, what I wanted to also ask or suggest is that the importance of engaging with boards. And as we need to challenge also the way sort of traditional governance is done, to not only have it a sort of two-way accountability, but also see boards as just one piece of a broader accountability system. It also should be board members that start demanding from the organization that there is public, but we can start with private, but that there is reporting as a complement or as a symbol of their own commitments. And so Lena, in terms of the bond, you know, knowing that there are conversations at different levels within bond, I think it's really important. We now have a board level peer learning group, and I will certainly pass on this information. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, for noting that. And one thing that I'll add is, you know, one of our indicators for the index is leadership, and we do talk and ask questions about you know, the board's role in accountability mechanisms within the organization, because too many times, you know, again, with our experience, boards have not done their job in holding organizations accountable for experiences of racial violence or racism within organizations, and letting a lot of white CEOs just give them a pass, you know, in many really horrible ways. So it is very much an important piece of you know, asking these questions in terms of how power dynamics and inherent power dynamics play a role in an environment that either promotes racial equity or does not. So yeah, Lena, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say also, yeah, really good point on the board. But also I think through the index, it helps to show that this is an everyone problem, and this is an everyone can get involved problem. And that might feel like it's really overwhelming, like, oh my God, no, it's the CEO or it's the HR or it's like it's their problem, because that actually everyone is responsible for this. And it's an opportunity wherever you are, whatever function you're doing, to get involved in it, because there's something that you can all do. We've seen time and time again and again with the blog that we put out as well. When you put it on one person's shoulders, look what happens. Nothing. A little bit, a little inch forward, and here we are in 2023. We still have the same issues. The previous approach that we used to take isn't working, which is why we need a different approach, and this is an incredible tool that can help get there.
And then Liz, to your question, Liz asks, are you also looking at different cultural contexts and settings in the international development sector, for example, South-South cooperation? Do similar dynamics play a role, or is this different due to a different historical legacy and trajectory, i.e. non-colonial and non-imperial? Really, really important question. Liz, is one that we constantly talk about within the collective. One thing that I will note is we have definitely said, in a few different ways and places and spaces for the Racial Equity Index, that what we are creating is version 1 of many, and what we're releasing next year is version 1 of many, because we know that, from even the global nature of our collective, that the conversations around racial equity are very different between regions, and very different even within those regions, based on the legacies of colonization and imperialism, and so the conversations within each of those contexts means that the questions that we ask around racial equity and the indicators are going to have to be different, and we acknowledge that, but we are also living off of a $50,000 grant for the Racial Equity Index. And so this is going to take us a lot of time until we are able to reach more sustainable funding to really be able to do this in a way where we can bring in all of the voices that need to be, in these discussions on how we talk about and measure racial equity within each of these regional contexts, and also within the regions themselves. That's our kind of big vision picture, but it's going to take us a while to get there. So what we are working on right now is very much kind of a global development, not necessarily blanket approach, but more of a broad approach for the global development sector, with the acknowledgement that racial equity shows up very differently in very different contexts. But we definitely want to get there. Lena, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you're good.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions before we turn it back over to Gigi and Partos team? Oh, this is a really good question, Bjorn, and I hope I am saying your name correctly. So Bjorn notes, many orgs are ready to fix things, but what strategies can we employ to get orgs involved when orgs will feel reputational damage by showing that there's a problem? So we can accept that we have a problem in the global development sector, but how to navigate this while we have a problem in global society and global systems. Spoke on a level of accountability and transparency and the risks involved for reputational damage when orgs attempt such audit, and findings, risks being shared publicly or leaked, I'm going to say, to funders questioning the organization. My question is how to overcome this and convince orgs to get on board. I'm going to just start this off, but Lena, I definitely want you to take this one on, because I know that you've talked extensively, in your conversations with organizations in Bond. But I will say, working not only as a consultant, supporting organizations doing racial equity audits, one of the things to note is that this is going to come out one way or the other. We saw this in 2020. We keep on seeing this, right? Issues of racism and racial violence do not live in some sort of vacuum. And so the experiences of individuals in an organization, people are, people have voices and they will use them. And so it will get out one way or the other. That is part and parcel of being part of this global development sector. You are beholden to the people that not only is your organization supporting and and working for, but the people that work in your organization. So I think that fear, yes, is always there, but it will happen one way or the other. I think the other piece of this is that the more organizations stay private about how hard this journey is, the more difficult it will be for organizations to find any sort of collegiality or transparency around working to better this issue across the sector. So organizations need to be vulnerable and say, this is a really difficult journey. What worked for you? What didn't work for you? How can we do this better? Where are we messing up? What are we not seeing? Where, ask all those questions. But if we just stay silent around these issues, there is going to be no change, and there is going to be no opportunity or space to engage in these conversations. So the overcoming and convincing organizations to get on board is, eventually, if an organization doesn't get on board, someone will say something. And, personally, I would suggest rather than hiring a crisis comms manager to deal with that leak, to address the issue head on, and acknowledge that there is an issue, and what can an organization do about it. Lena, I'm gonna let you close this out.
Yeah, so the work I've been doing since 2020 in Bond has been working with CEOs and boards, and we're moving to policy engagement as well on anti-racism and decolonization intersectionally. And so the UK government is very different to the Dutch government, and I would say that the Dutch government is more progressive from my perspective. This is a conversation that comes up a lot, and I'm very aware of how our sector in the UK is moving at two different speeds. There are organizations who are on board with this, talking about shift the power, really changing their headquarters, what they're doing, their CEOs, their boards, and then there's a whole other load of them who are doing nothing. And it comes down to where the power is really, because, and we've touched upon it already, funders and donors, we don't see the same thing that's happening in the UK that we did when the issues around safeguarding came up, and there were restrictions on funding if you don't have safeguarding policies in place, if you don't have this, that, and the other. We don't see that with racism and intersectionality at all. And so that is a whole other conversation about changing the philanthropic sector. So there is a faster moving section of the UK sector that is committed to this, but a lot of the stuff is being done behind doors, and we're more working strategically to think about how can we become more public about it, because to Uma's point, she's completely right. If this continues to happen behind closed doors, no one knows this progress is going on, and to some extent, and in the UK, again, I can only talk from the UK perspective, and perhaps I'll say the more right-wing journalism and press that we see about UK international development, UK aid, which is a really hot topic at the moment, especially after Brexit, we see how the sector gets a battering, and the organizations don't necessarily want to then open themselves up even more to say, actually, we also have problems internally. Not that we're not doing all the other things right. When the general public believes, is on the fence about if we should be even spending money in international development. So it's a really hostile environment at the moment, but there is like slices of hope. And it does make me think, Gigi, which we haven't spoken about it all yet, but in terms of the work that I've been doing with specifically with the CEOs, we've engaged with 101 organizations, okay? And we've got like a group of 40 CEOs, the big ones, the small ones, who are already engaged in this work and thinking about how they can start to have conversations like these with donors and government. You can't necessarily have a conversation about racial equity with the UK government, but you can about locally led development. There are different ways that you can start to open up and talk about it, and also share then your progress on it. And I'm wondering, in the back of my mind, Gigi, if it would be useful for your members to maybe meet some of our members who are already doing this, because they have been through a lot, and they are not there, and they're not perfect, but they are on a journey, and they're more willing to share what's gone wrong and where they're kind of overcoming some of those things. And that might be of help, but it is definitely important, and there is work going on. And so I would say, perhaps in a section of the civil society in the Netherlands, there is probably change going on, and it might be in the smaller organizations as well, because I feel like they're more radical than the larger ones who have more bureaucracy levels to go through. But you already have, again, from my perspective, a more progressive government. So I think that there would be pockets of progress, and maybe that's something that we can do to share more of our knowledge from what's happening in the UK as well, and with organizations to help. And if there are some CEOs who want to talk to some of the CEOs from your organizations, maybe it will help them be like, yeah, we can do this.
Thank you so much, Lena. And thank you everybody for your questions. Gigi, I'm going to turn this back over to you before we run out of time.
Yeah, let me first start with a very big thanks to Uma and Lena for this great presentation, but also your really refined answers to all these questions. I've been riding along. I'm always inspired, as you know, with your work. I just wanted to, before closing this session, I just wanted to thank everybody here who participated as well. Who came in to listen. Congratulations for being here, because I think it's the first intentional step towards showing more commitment and being more committed towards racial equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm very welcoming your proposal, Lina, to create more exchange between the Dutch and UK NGO sector when it comes to this work. And I do see that there are a lot of connections with our decolonization, shift of power, localization work. So definitely. I just wanted to end with a request to everybody, because we came here, we listened to the information of this wonderful initiative of the Racial Equity Index, and I think it's really a next step to get into action. And we want to help and support with making this step smaller by also creating the opportunity for Partos members to get into this introspection and take this assessment, and then also come back with a cohort to exchange on what you're experiencing within your organization. So it's not just a lonely process that you're going through, which it often might be. And secondly, I also invite all the other organizations that are not part of the Partos members or network. There is an open invitation to take this audit as well. And when you do so, share your resources, because it's extremely important that these types of initiatives can continue. And it's not just only on goodwill. That's, I think, 99% of the heart of people that is put into these initiatives, but also understand the importance of resources and resourcing these type of initiatives. So with that note, I would like to end. If you want to reach out to us, you can find my email address in the chat, but also on the Partos website, and we'll make sure that all the information, recordings, and links to the Racial Equity Index will be shared, including the next steps if you want to take this within your organization. So thank you again, and if you have any questions, please reach out.